The wind that day had teeth. It came down from the northern ridges, cutting through the white valley like an old ghost that had forgotten mercy. Eli Mercer leaned against the corral fence, his hat brim dusted with frost, watching the world turn to silver silence. The ranch had been quiet for 3 winters now, ever since the fire took his wife and the child she had carried never saw the spring. He had buried his heart beside them, or so he'd believed. The snow had become his only companion, and the whiskey his only prayer. But that morning, when he saw the figure stumbling through the blizzard, a woman wrapped in rags, clutching her belly as though holding the world inside her, something deep inside him stirred for the first time in years. He thought at first she was a spirit. The way her shawl fluttered like broken wings, the way she moved against the wind with stubborn, quiet grace. Then she fell halfway between the cottonwoods and the fence, and instinct overtook grief. Eli ran through the drifts, his boots sinking deep, his lungs burning with the cold. When he reached her, she was still breathing, barely. Snow had gathered in her hair, dark strands frozen against her skin. Her lips were cracked, her hands raw from the cold, but her belly, rounded, heavy, full of life, pressed against the threadbare fabric of her dress like a miracle refusing to die. He carried her inside without a word, his old cabin creaking with the sudden weight of the living. He laid her near the fire, stripped the wet shawl from her shoulders, and poured warm water into her trembling palms. Her eyes opened, green and wild, not the eyes of a lost woman, but of someone who had fought too long and was still unwilling to surrender. She whispered something in a tongue Eli did not recognize, a sound like wind over stone. Apache, he thought, though she wore no paint, no feathers, only the scars of running. Hours passed before she spoke again. Her voice was soft, wary. "You should have let me die out there," she said, watching the firelight dance. Eli shook his head. "Ma'am, I've buried too many ghosts already. I ain't adding one more to the snow." She looked away, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she placed her hand on her belly, protective, defiant. "They killed his father," she whispered. "They'll come for me next." Something in those words settled heavy in Eli's chest. He didn't ask who they were. He'd seen enough of the border wars, enough blood between ranchers and Apache to know that revenge always traveled in packs. But when she looked up at him again, eyes filled with both fear and fire, he knew he would not turn her out. "You'll stay," he said simply, "till the storm ends." Outside, the snow thickened, burying the tracks she had left behind. Inside, for the first time in 3 winters, Eli felt the cabin breathe. He poured her broth, wrapped her in blankets, and fed the fire until the night turned gold around them. She slept at last, one hand resting over her unborn child, and Eli sat there, staring at the quiet rise and fall of her breathing, feeling the faint, impossible rhythm of hope thawing inside him. By dawn, the storm had eased, but he did not wake her. He stepped outside, watched the sun struggle through clouds, and thought about the promise he hadn't made but already felt bound to. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled, a warning or perhaps a welcome. The land was wide, merciless, and honest. So was the woman sleeping in his cabin. Eli Mercer, who once believed he'd forgotten how to care, whispered to the rising light, "Maybe God ain't done with me yet." When she woke, the world outside had turned into a hush of white, the kind that swallowed all sound and mercy alike. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and old coffee, and Eli was at the stove stirring a pot of beans as if this had always been their rhythm. A man, a woman, and a morning trying to remember warmth. She stirred, her green eyes opening slow, scanning the rough wood walls and the rifle above the door. Instinct made her reach for the knife she didn't have. Eli turned, met her gaze, and raised both hands, palms out, peace offering in his rough cowboy way. "Ain't gonna hurt you," he said gently. "Name's Eli Mercer. You're safe here." She hesitated before answering, her voice low but edged like a blade that had cut through too much truth. "Naira." The name carried a sound like running water, soft, strong, never still. She sat up, clutching her belly as a sharp breath escaped her lips. "You shouldn't have brought me here," she said. "If they find me, then they'll have to go through me," Eli said, his voice even, a tone born of men who'd lost too much to be afraid anymore. He brought her a bowl of beans, steam rising between them. "Eat, you need strength. That little one's counting on you." She took the bowl, her hands trembling from more than cold. "You don't understand. His father was one of them, a warrior, proud. They called him Greyhawk. He died to keep me alive. Now the white men think I carry a secret and the Apache think I carry shame. No place left to go." Her words cracked like ice breaking on a river. Eli listened, silent, eyes shadowed beneath his hat brim. He had fought Apache once years ago, back when he still believed in sides. But sitting there, seeing her hands cradle life instead of death, he felt something shift deep in the marrow of him. "That ain't shame you're carrying," he said after a long pause. "That's courage." Naira looked at him like no one had ever said that word to her before. For a heartbeat, her chin trembled, and she whispered, "You don't know what they'll do if they find me." Eli's eyes flicked toward the window where snow fell steady as breathing. "Let 'em come," he said simply. "This land's big enough to bury fear." For the next few days, they lived in quiet rhythm. Eli chopped wood while Naira mended old shirts, her fingers deft and delicate. Sometimes she hummed to her unborn child in her language, and the sound of it filled the cabin like prayer. Eli found himself listening longer than he meant to, memorizing the rise and fall of her voice. At night, he would sit near the fire, whittling wood into small shapes, a horse, a bird, once even a cradle, though he never said why. She watched him sometimes, eyes soft, the firelight painting both their faces gold. But peace in the frontier was always a borrowed thing. It never stayed long. On the fourth night, Eli's horse stirred outside, nostrils flaring, hooves pawing at the frozen earth. He went still, every muscle taut. Then came the sound, faint, deliberate, of someone moving through snow. Not animal. Men. Eli motioned for Naira to stay silent. He took the rifle from above the door, cocked it slow, and blew out the lamp. The moon bled pale light through the frosted window, enough to see shadows moving near the barn, 2, maybe 3. Then one voice called out in English, rough and slurred, "Mercer, we know she's in there. Hand her over, and we'll let your ranch stand." Naira's breath caught. She grabbed his sleeve, whispering in panic, "They'll kill you. You don't owe me anything." Eli looked at her, and something raw and quiet passed through him. "You're wrong about that," he said. "I owe you a reason to remember I'm still a man." Before she could speak, he was already outside, the rifle in his hands and the wind clawing at his coat. 3 riders waited beyond the fence, their horses stamping restless. One held a torch. "You harboring an Apache woman, Mercer?" The lead one snarled. "Ain't wise mixin' with that kind." Eli's voice was low, steady. "She ain't yours to claim." "Ride on." The man spat in the snow. "That half-breed she carries ain't worth dying for." The words lit something fierce behind Eli's ribs. He raised the rifle slow, and though his hands trembled, his aim didn't. "Then I reckon you best start riding fast," he said. "'Cause I'll die before I let you near her." There was a moment's silence, and long enough for the snow to whisper between them. Then the men cursed, turned, and rode off into the white, the torch fading into the storm like a memory of hate. Eli stood there until the sound of hooves was gone, the cold cutting through his bones but not his resolve. When he stepped back inside, Naira was standing, tears in her eyes, her hand trembling over her belly. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Eli looked at her and for the first time in years smiled. "Maybe I did. Maybe I needed to remember who I was." Outside, the snow began again, soft this time, like blessing instead of burden. Inside, Naira whispered a word he didn't understand, but it sounded a lot like gratitude. The days that followed settled into a fragile peace like thin ice that dared the sun to hold. Eli fixed the roof where the snow had caved it, and Naira, wrapped in one of his old wool coats, moved slower now, her belly heavy, her breath coming shorter each morning. Sometimes he'd find her standing near the window, staring toward the horizon as if listening for ghosts. He knew she feared the riders might return, white men hungry for bounty or revenge. But something in her eyes told him there was another fear riding closer, the kind that didn't come on horseback. One evening, as the dusk poured violet over the ridges, Eli found her outside near the well. She was tracing a symbol in the snow, a small circle with 3 marks beneath it. "What's that mean?" he asked. She looked up, her breath misting in the cold. "It's an Apache sign. For protection. My father used to carve it into trees when we moved camp." Eli crouched beside her, watching the pattern glimmer in the moonlight. "You still believe in signs?" She smiled faintly. "I believe in what we need to believe to keep breathing." He wanted to tell her he understood, that he'd once prayed to whiskey bottles in silence, but instead, he just nodded and looked toward the darkening hills. "Whatever comes," he said softly, "we'll meet it together." That night, a storm began its slow birth. Wind clawed at the shutters, and the fire hissed and spat as snow gathered thick around the cabin. Naira lay near the hearth, her hands over her belly, her eyes closed. Eli sat nearby, carving another small figure. A mother holding a child this time, the edges rough but tender. When she opened her eyes and saw it, she smiled through exhaustion. "You make them as if you've seen them before," she said. Eli stared at the wood in his palm, his throat tight. "Once," he whispered. "Long ago." The wind howled outside, and Naira's face softened. "She was your wife," she said gently. "The one the fire took." He looked at her, surprised, but she didn't flinch. Her voice carried no intrusion, only understanding. The kind that came from someone who'd buried her own share of love. "Her name was Anna," he said after a long pause. "We were going to have a boy. Lost them both in one night. Thought I buried the man I was that day, too." Naira's eyes glistened. Maybe he was just waiting for the snow to thaw. Something unspoken passed between them then, something older than words, warmer than fire. Eli felt it settle deep in his chest, a quiet ache that wasn't grief anymore but hope trying to remember its shape. He didn't reach for her, didn't need to. Sometimes being near was enough. By midnight the storm had turned furious. The cabin walls shuddered with the wind's rage. Then through the blizzard's roar came another sound, unfaint, rhythmic, distant. Drums. Naira's eyes flew open. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." Eli rose, rifle in hand, moving to the window. Through the white blur he saw shapes, dark riders moving slow, steady, deliberate. There were at least a dozen, maybe more, torches flickering against the night. "Apache?" he asked quietly. Naira nodded, trembling. "My father's people. They found me." Eli turned toward her, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. "You think they'll take you back?" She shook her head, eyes wide. "Not as I am. I broke their law, carried the child of a man from another tribe. They won't kill me while I carry life, but once I give birth—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He had fought these men once, years ago, but now he saw no enemies in them, only a code older than his own. Still, he stepped closer to her, voice low but steady. "Then we keep the fire lit. They won't take you while I draw breath." Hours passed like lifetimes. The storm hid them well, but the drums came closer, pulsing through the ground like the heartbeat of the land itself. Eli set extra logs on the fire, packed cartridges into his rifle, and prayed to a god he'd long since stopped believing in. Naira knelt by the window, whispering words in her tongue, neither plea nor curse, but something between the two. Then, without warning, a pain ripped through her body. She gasped, gripping the chair for balance. Eli spun toward her. "What is it?" Her voice broke on the wind. "It's time." The world went silent then, just the storm, the fire, and the raw sound of life demanding to be born. Eli's mind blurred between fear and purpose. He boiled water, tore blankets, knelt beside her as she labored through pain that made the walls shake. Outside, the drums grew louder, closer. Naira cried out once, twice, then bit her lip to keep from screaming. "You're not alone," Eli whispered, wiping her brow. Not anymore, the hours blurred. Snow piled higher against the windows. And when at last the cry came, small, piercing, alive, Eli felt his knees weaken. He lifted the child with trembling hands, the firelight glinting off the tiny face. A boy. Naira lay back, tears streaming down her cheeks, both from agony and awe. Eli placed the newborn in her arms. "He's strong," he said softly. She looked at the child, then at him, and whispered, "Greyhawk's blood, and yours." Eli didn't speak. He just knelt there, watching mother and son, the world beyond their walls falling away. But when he glanced toward the window, the torches had stopped moving. The riders had gathered at the edge of the clearing, watching in silence. Among them, one man raised a hand, and not in threat but in acknowledgement. Naira saw it too. "My father," she murmured. Eli lowered his rifle. The man outside sat tall on his horse, face carved from years of war and wind, eyes fixed on the cabin. Then slowly he dismounted, knelt in the snow, and pressed his palm to the earth. The same sign Naira had drawn earlier. The circle and 3 marks, protection. She wept then, not from fear but release. "He's blessing us," she whispered. Eli stood beside her, hand on her shoulder as the riders turned back into the storm. The drums faded. The land was quiet again. When dawn came, the world was gold and white, soft and new. Eli stood at the window watching the sun touch the snow. and turned to see Naira asleep with her child against her heart. And that was when he said it, quietly, reverently, as though speaking to both of them. You need a father. And I need a son to remember who I was. Winter loosened its grip slow, like an old man releasing a prayer he'd held too long. The snow still clung to the ridges, but sunlight now touched it with gold instead of cold. Eli's ranch, once a tomb of silence, had begun to breathe again. The cry of a child, the creak of the rocking chair, the steady rhythm of two souls who'd forgotten how to dream learning again, one heartbeat at a time. They named the boy Lone Hawk, after both bloodlines that lived inside him. His skin carried a soft bronze warmth that made the firelight love him. His eyes, deep and bright, mirrored the storm that had brought him into the world. When Eli held him, it felt like cradling a promise, not the kind made with words, but the kind the heart makes when it dares to heal. Naira moved through the cabin with a quiet grace, her strength returning slowly. Eli would sometimes find her humming while feeding the boy, an old Apache lullaby that sounded like wind over canyon stones. He never asked what it meant. He just listened, letting the melody braid itself into the air, binding the three of them in something holy. Days passed into weeks, and the rhythm of life began to grow roots. Eli worked the fences again, repaired the barn, and split logs until his shoulders burned. He'd pause sometimes, hearing the babies laugh from inside the cabin. A small sound, but it had a way of echoing across the land like a song. Naira would stand at the doorway watching him work, the wind tugging at her hair. There were moments when their eyes would meet, brief, quiet, and though neither spoke, something unspoken always passed between them. One afternoon, the snow melted enough for Eli to ride to the trading post for supplies. Before leaving, he lingered at the door, unsure why the act of stepping away felt heavier than any saddle. Naira stood holding Lone Hawk, her hair lit by the morning sun. Be careful, she said softly. The world beyond this hill hasn't changed as much as it should. He tipped his hat, smiling faintly. I'll be back before the moon climbs. But as he rode across the open stretch of valley, he realized something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't ride alone anymore. Somewhere behind him, warmth waited. A fire, a family. At the post, whispers followed him the way they always had. The lonely rancher who'd lost everything. But when one of the men, a trader with too much whiskey and too little soul, smirked and said, Heard you got yourself an Indian woman up there, Eli didn't look away this time. He met the man's gaze and said simply, She's got herself a home. The silence that followed was heavy, but it didn't bother him. For the first time since the fire that had burned his past, Eli Mercer knew who he was again. When he returned, dusk was falling. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through the window he saw Naira rocking the baby, the firelight gilding them both. Something deep inside him cracked open, a quiet, wordless thing that might have been joy. He stepped inside and she looked up. You're late, she teased softly. Had to teach a fool some manners, he said with a half smile. She laughed, a sound that filled the cabin like spring water. And for a moment, the whole world felt smaller, safer. He handed her a parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside was a tiny pair of leather moccasins, stitched by hand. They're for him, he said, nodding to the baby. Figured he'll be walking sooner than I'm ready. Naira ran her fingers over them, her eyes shining. You made these? He shrugged. Guess I did. They're beautiful, she whispered. You've got a gentle soul, Eli Mercer. He looked away, suddenly shy, his weathered hands gripping his hat brim. Ain't sure about gentle, but I'm learning again. That night, as the wind softened to a whisper and the stars stretched wide above the world, Naira placed the baby in his cradle and turned to the fire. My people will come again when spring opens the passes, she said quietly. They'll want to see the child, maybe even take us back. Eli's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. And if you want to go? She looked at him for a long time before answering. Once I thought I'd never belong anywhere. Not with the Apache, not with the white man. But here, she gestured to the cabin, the cradle, the snow beyond the window. Here I belong to the land, to him, maybe even to you. Eli's breath caught. The firelight flickered across her face, painting her in gold and shadow. He took a slow step closer. You already do, he said quietly. Both of you. She smiled, tears catching in the corner of her lashes. Then maybe I won't run when the thaw comes. Outside, the snow was melting, drop by drop, revealing the dark soil beneath, the promise of things that could grow again. The night sang softly with the sound of melting ice and a baby's steady breathing, and as Eli sat near the fire, Naira's head resting against his shoulder, he thought that maybe, just maybe, winter had finally ended. Not just in the valley, but in him. For the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of loss. Spring came slow to the high valley, as though the earth itself feared breaking the stillness that winter had built. The snow melted in size, slipping down from the ridges into clear streams that sang where silence used to live. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. New grass pushed up through the thaw like faith reborn. For the first time in years, Eli Mercer rose with the sun not to bury something, but to build. The ranch was alive again. Horses whinnied in the pasture, their coats sleek under the growing warmth. The fences he'd once let rot now stood straight and strong, and through it all, laughter, small, fragile, but true, carried from the cabin like birdsong. Lone Hawk was growing fast, a bundle of energy and sunlight, his little feet chasing the shadows that once ruled Eli's heart. Every time Eli lifted him, the boy reached for his face and grabbed his beard, giggling, and Naira would laugh, that soft, rolling sound that healed more than words ever could. Naira had grown stronger too. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her hair, black as raven wings, glowed under the spring light. She spent her mornings tending to the small garden near the cabin, herbs, corn, and wildflowers that she said would keep the spirits kind. Sometimes she'd hum to the wind, and Eli would swear the mountains listened. As the days grew long and warm, the Apache riders returned, just as Naira had said. But this time there was no fear. Eli stood beside her when they came, holding Lone Hawk in his arms. The men dismounted in silence, eyes sharp but not unkind. Among them was Naira's father, the old chief, shoulders like stone, eyes deep with years of war and sorrow. He approached slow, his gaze resting first on Naira, then on the child, then on Eli. For a moment no one spoke. The wind moved through the grass like a whisper from the old world. Then the chief lifted his hand, palm open, and spoke in Apache. Naira translated softly. "He says the land has chosen. He says the spirits of our blood walk together now." Eli nodded, unsure if words would help or harm. He just held the boy tighter, letting his silence speak what his heart already had. That this woman and child were his, not by claim, but by choice. The chief studied him a moment longer, then reached out and touched Lone Hawk's head. "He will walk between two fires," the old man said, his voice low and grave. "But he will burn with neither." Then, as sudden as they'd come, the riders turned and rode away, their figures vanishing into the gold horizon. Naira stood watching them until they were gone, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, and not of sorrow, but of peace. She turned to Eli, who was still holding the boy, and smiled. "My father gave us his blessing," she whispered. "He never blesses easily." Eli's eyes softened. "Reckon I'll try not to waste it then." That evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the snowcaps in amber, they sat on the porch together. Naira's head rested on his shoulder, Lone Hawk asleep in her arms. Eli watched the sky turn from gold to violet, his hand covering hers. "You ever think," he said quietly, "how two lost souls can find each other in a storm?" Naira smiled faintly. The storm never meant to destroy. It only wanted to clear the air. He turned toward her, then slow, reverent, his voice roughened by years of silence. "I thought I'd forgotten how to feel. Then you walked out of the snow, and suddenly the fire remembered how to burn." She looked up, eyes shining in the dusk. "And you looked at me, not like a stranger, but like someone who'd been waiting." "I reckon I was," he murmured. "Maybe my whole life." They kissed then, slow, certain, the kind of kiss that doesn't take, but gives. The land around them hummed with quiet things, the whisper of pines, the soft stir of life returning to every forgotten corner. The world felt wide again, but not empty. Later, when the stars came out, Eli carried Lone Hawk to his cradle and stood watching him sleep. The child's tiny chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, and Eli felt that same rhythm pulse in his own chest. He reached out, brushed a hand across the boy's hair, and whispered the words he'd spoken once before, words that now felt like a vow fulfilled. "You need a father, and I need a son to remember who I was." Behind him, Naira stepped close, wrapping her arms around his waist. "And who are you now, Eli Mercer?" she whispered. He turned, pressing a kiss to her forehead. A man with a family, a man the snow couldn't bury. Outside, the valley lay quiet beneath the stars, the wind carrying the scent of cedar and new life. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the mountains answered with their eternal echo, not of loneliness, but of belonging. Spring had finally claimed the land, and with it, every heart that had once been frozen. And under that wide, endless western sky, 3 souls sat in the glow of their fire: the cowboy who had lost everything, the Apache woman who carried both life and forgiveness, and the child who would remember them both.